everybody. Can you hear me okay? Sounds good? Okay, I know this is going to be a little bit cheesy. I mean, we've kind of got the queso going, so I'm just going to go with the theme of cheese. But this is a group and a community that I have admired quite a bit for quite a while, mostly via Twitter. But I know this is cheesy, but I am truly honored to be here and feel like it's pretty special that it's at SportsEngine too. So all the warm fuzzies, yeah. You're gonna get a little bit of a taste of SportsEngine in this talk. This is the first time I've given this talk in front of coworkers. So that'll be different and fun. There are screenshots. Nobody's identity is revealed, but this is the first time that I'm doing that. So it'll be fun. So I like to start all of my talks with a bit of a disclaimer, and that typically is my intro slide. So my name is Amy. I really like Twitter. Obviously, it's how I've admired this community, among other things. I think Twitter, as silly as it can also be really helpful, especially as engineers. So I like Twitter. Follow me. I'll chat. I talked about microwaving fish in an open office setting, and if that's an okay thing today. I usually tweet about more interesting things, but that was the topic today. So I am the lead front-end software engineer here at SportsEngine. This serves a little bit as a disclaimer. Again, I think the disclaimers make sense because if I'm going to stand up here and give you any kind of general recommendation or feedback, I think it's important that you understand where I'm coming from. There are certain things that are very instinctual for me, are easier for me, are more comfortable for me than they will be for you. And I hope that this talk is full of content that is not just for other folks who are wired like me, but I'm going to give you my disclaimers anyways. So as the lead front-end software engineer here, I have a few folks who report to me. I am trying to get a group of individuals aligned around the future of front-end development at SportsEngine. We spend a lot of time talking about best practices, standards we want to follow. So naturally, there's a lot of opportunity in that just through code reviews, right? So there's already going to be some interest there. It's a thing that I do every single day. I think most of us at SportsEngine probably review code every single day. So it's pretty close to me there. The other thing I like to share with folks is that I grew up in Maine, and then I lived in Boston for about 4 years before I settled in Minnesota. And the reason why I like to use this as a disclaimer is because it means that I have had experience with a variety of communication styles. Right, so in Maine and Boston, there was a lot of the aggression. People only spoke to you when they were mad at you. And then here in Minnesota, I've gotten a taste of that passive-aggressive, post-it notes, sort of nice. My husband is a Minnesota native, and I joke and say that he had a feeling once, and his parents told him to put it away. So I've learned that was a joke. Oh no, are there a lot of native Minnesotans in the room? I'm so sorry if that was supposed to be funny. There it is, it's too real, sorry, you're right. But because of that, I feel like I've had to get pretty intentional about when I want to have effective communication and respectful communication, that it has to change based on who you're interacting with. So the way that you might choose to communicate by instinct might be different than what that other person needs. Definitely the case with my husband and I. And lastly, I like to share my Myers Briggs. Now I know Myers Briggs might be as useful as like, which latte are you? But I found that there was some value in this. And there are two big pieces. First of all, are there any other ENFJs in this room? This usually happens. When I took this, so I took like a career-focused Myers-Briggs, and they told me, so they like compile years of research with other people with your personality types, and they told me that the worst job for me would be a programmer. So they are actively trying to discourage ENFJs from entering the industry, but we will get there. We can be happy here too. So there's two things there. Does anybody know what that E stands for? Extrovert. Are there any other extroverts in the room? Yeah. Yeah, we're here. So Myers-Briggs has, the way that they take it, you've got like a kind of a neutral zone, and then you have extroversion on one side and introversion on the other. And the one that I took, it was a scale of 0 to 30 on either side. I was a 30 out of 30 as an extrovert. So hence the reason why I really like meetups and communities and Twitter and people. And I've spent my career trying to find ways to inject more human interaction into my experience as an engineer. So obviously, naturally, code reviews. If I am getting tired or lonely, I'm not getting enough energy because I'm not interacting with enough people, I will just have somebody review my code because that's an excuse to interact with another human. So I like code reviews. The other big piece about ENFJs is that we get horribly discouraged without receiving any kind of feedback. So it could be positive, negative, general, specific. I would rather have a post-it note on my desk that says you suck than have nothing at all, which is not, that's terrible feedback. We'll talk about that later. But that craving for feedback, that's a piece that gives me energy and that I really need, means that I've had to be intentional about seeking out feedback because it isn't natural for a lot of people. So code reviews, again, natural instinct there. So obviously, kind of makes sense that I would want to talk about code reviews. So let's do that. How many of you have ever given a code review? You were the reviewer. Yeah, me too. How many of you have ever received a code review? Nice. Has it ever felt like this? Oh, that's not that many hands. Yeah, okay, it definitely felt like this for me. So I come from a fairly traditional computer science background, and while we didn't learn any version control or web technologies, we spent some time doing a code review. And it was a setup that was actually fairly similar to this. Some of us were chatting over food earlier. We sat in a classroom, and the author of the code walked up to their computer, put it up on the screen, and then we had a room full of folks who then were just reviewing the code on the spot. It was the first time they had ever seen that code, and then we were getting graded by our professor who sat in the back of the room, grading us on how well we received the feedback and what kind of feedback we gave, in addition to the quality of our code that we were presenting. So it was terrible. It was a terrible experience. Right, so my first job, I worked at a very small company. There were, I think, 18 of us total at its max. We had a software development team of like 4 or 5 when I first started, and I had gone to a conference and attended a talk about code reviews. And of course, it was like heart eye emojis all over the place because I'm like, this is what I've been missing. I just need like a real way for people to review my code because then it like combines my love for humans and my love for code. This will be great. And I went back to my team and I was so excited to start implementing code reviews, and it went something like this. It was pretty unsuccessful. So what I got out of this talk was this, it made sense to me. I wanted to do this, but I didn't have a lot of practical ways to go back to my team and figure out how we could actually implement code reviews. How could we make it something that felt like a natural part of our process where we could have accountability, we could build trust, we could create a learning culture. It wasn't great. So I kind of took that and hadn't lost my desire for code reviews. But I felt like I was missing something. And at the same time, I had received some advice about speaking. Somebody once told me to write the abstract of the talk that you wish to attend. This is really great advice. So I wrote the very first iteration of the abstract for this talk and submitted it to a conference. And it got accepted, which was terrifying because then I actually had to give a talk on something that I had no idea, I knew nothing about it. Which is, a side note, another really great way to learn something is to give a talk on it. So I did this, and that's kind of where this talk came from. And it's evolved a lot over, the first time I gave this talk was 4 years ago. It's evolved a lot as I've been on different teams and had different experiences. And you're gonna get a taste of how that's changed and in why I intentionally changed some of it. We're going to talk about what code reviews actually are, why are they worth it, what you should be reviewing. I'm really big on terminology, so we're going to make sure we're on the same page about what the heck code reviews even are. We're going to chat about who should be involved, when they should happen, and how they should happen. Sound good? Excited? Yeah? All right, it's Tuesday night. It's all right. All right, so what are code reviews and why are they useful? Well, they're the part in the software development process where humans evaluate another human's code. That's pretty much it. Pretty straightforward. Nice. Software is written by humans, most of it. I guess eventually all software is written by humans, right? There's some of that other stuff going on. But humans make mistakes, and by the transitive property, software has mistakes, right? Mathematicians in the room telling me that's not right. Still okay. No one's corrected me yet on that, so I'm going to go with it's right. All right, so software has mistakes. We got to find it. Do any of you have a lot of those like as seen on TV products? You know what I'm talking about? The infomercials. I grew up in what I call the infomercial household. My dad was a sucker for all of those, and we had like every kind of gadget and appliance, and he would sit down and watch infomercials like they were TV. So I'm going to take you on a code review infomercial. Are you ready? So how do most infomercials start? With the terrible things, right? They show you these like bizarre scenarios of like things that shouldn't, like this just shouldn't be happening. I don't know what problem this particular individual has, but that just shouldn't be that difficult. I don't know, right? So you could picture maybe the worst code review you've ever had, right? And it's in black and white because for some reason these things are always in black and white. And it's just awful. So for me, I think a version of that might be, okay, this is just going to get really personal here. I'm going to go for it. Like one of my worst experiences, or like that I could imagine, this hasn't actually happened, but having a code review with a more senior engineer, someone I maybe perceive to be more senior, who I have so much respect for, and I really just want them to like me and think I write really great code, and they just get in there and look at my code and have like an LOL what moment and then walk away. Like that would be my nightmare code review. So picture this nightmare code review. It's in black and white. And now I'm going to tell you how everything can be better. Here's your code review guarantee. You get to catch mistakes in the least costly of development times, right? How better to discover this right now before your QA analyst even does? Nothing's even been pushed to production yet, maybe, depending on how you do code reviews. Hopefully, nothing's been pushed to production yet. You'll get to ensure that the team is held accountable to quality standards and expectations. Maybe you have certain ways that you do things, and you want to make sure that there's a little bit of accountability there. You'll get to share domain knowledge across the entire team. Maybe you have folks who never work in one part of the code base, and they get to review code over there, and they get to see some ways that other teams are doing things. So far, so good. Get to provide opportunities to learn, to mentor, to teach others, kind of create and establish some of that learning culture. But wait, there's more, right? And okay, all right. Finally, this is the cheesy part. This is what I love. I think code reviews really do help you build a stronger foundation of trust within your team. So it's full of win, right? This is good. This is a good thing. Everybody convinced? I've got more. Listen to this. Effectiveness of code review for determining faults in software is between 30 and 35% more effective than standard unit testing. Does that just blow your mind? I mean, I can share this study with you if you don't believe it. I know this is just a big quote on a screen, but there have been many studies about trying to understand the effectiveness of code reviews, even taking into account factors like how long are you spending reviewing somebody else's code, how many people are involved, and trying to see how many faults you find within that code within that given amount of time. And I found that it's even more effective than standard unit testing, which is shocking to me because we spend so much time trying to integrate unit testing into our process, which we should. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying do this over that, but we don't spend nearly as much time talking about code reviews, or at least in my experience, we don't spend nearly as much time talking about code reviews. Okay, now you're convinced, and here's the now what, right? So the first time I gave this talk, it was 6 days before my wedding. So I had marriage on the brain a little bit. And I really think that code reviews are like marriage. And this is where I'm going to tell you that it's really up to you and your team. You get to make up the rules. There isn't one definition for what this looks like. And depending on even just the personality types on your team, if you have a team full of introverts, you might choose to tackle this a different way than a team full of extroverts might. And that's okay. I think you get to decide, try different things, experiment, and make something work for your team. So I'll give you a couple of suggestions for that. What should you be reviewing? Code, right? For bugs. Standard internet cat picture. It probably has to happen at some point in a talk. All right, here we go. What should you be reviewing? Code you didn't work on, although I get into a habit where when I create a code review or I get some code set up, I tend to review it myself before I tell another engineer that it's ready for review. I'll review it as if it wasn't even the code that I wrote. But eventually you should get somebody who is not the author to review that code. 200 to 400 lines actually is it. a good chunk of code review. This is like kind of that effective peak of your ability to be able to find those faults and to time box it to less than an hour. So if you are staring at a PR that has like 2,000 lines of code that you're supposed to be reviewing, maybe that's a good opportunity to figure out how to do that in different chunks, maybe tag another reviewer into that process. We're just trying to find the right amount of time and code to make sure that we're effective in our code review. It's hard. I just want to say that. Finding bugs in code is hard. Finding bugs in somebody else's code is even harder. There's often a reason why it turns into a QA analyst, or hopefully not, but maybe a user who's telling you that there is a bug. I like to make things in my life fairly algorithmic, especially with that like super native Minnesotan husband of mine. We do marriage retrospectives, and every 2 weeks. It's very helpful. We have to-dos and checklists. We use Scrum to plan our wedding. I tend to like apply these things. Yeah, I'm getting the looks. It worked very well. All right. And I like to find ways to automate, to put an algorithm around it. I found that really helpful with code reviews as well. Creating a checklist of things for you to review each time you sit down and do a code review is really helpful. It helps you remember the types of things that you're looking for, and it allows your team to have a discussion about what's important to you as a team. So there are 4 big categories that I want to focus on, and we'll dive into each of these more specifically. So correctness, clarity, efficiency, and style. At least 2 of these are very subjective, right? Like clarity, style. There's some subjective things there. I promise I'll get there. So to start, correctness. Does the code do what it's supposed to do? Right? There's some common things you can look for. Off by 1, maybe there's some copy and paste errors. So many of my problems are usually spelling mistakes. Think about edge cases, exception handling, data validation. Think about security at this point. Copy pasta, that's a thing people say, right? Copy pasta errors. So much of our jobs is just like copying code other people wrote and just pasting it in and modifying a few things. So there's probably going to be something there. All right, clarity and maintainability. I think this is one of the ones that we probably discuss as a team a lot, or in my experience, we spend a lot of time being like, I don't get it. Can we name this variable something different? Could we change the way that this function is named? One of my favorite ways to kind of test the clarity of the code is have somebody other than the author sit down and out loud describe what the code is doing, describe what is going on. And if they're really struggling to do that, that's probably a good sign that there's maybe some opportunity to change some things within the code base. You can think about things like self-documenting naming conventions, function length and purpose. If you are describing what a function does and you're using the word and more than once, there's probably an opportunity to break it up. File length and purpose, again, if you're trying to do like a single purpose file for each thing, depending on how you feel about guard clauses, ternary operators, there's a lot in that. I really love guard clauses, but I get in trouble for having multiple return statements in a function sometimes. But you guys get to decide what is important to you and your team. And this is a really, really hard thing to identify and to talk about. So I like to bring in my friend Potato to help tell this story. This is my cat, Potato. We have 3 cats, Potato, Galactus, Devourer of Worlds. We call her Galactus for short, and Greg. But Potato is really the star of the show. It's very distracting to have that GIF, so we were doing some programming. Oh, you're not laughing at my jokes. Yeah, there's more groans than anything. All right, well, you know my humor. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story about Potato, and I promise I will tie it back to clarity and maintainability in code. So when my husband and I got married, we learned some things about each other, like most partners do when they move into with each other. They learn that there are certain things about their partner that drive them wild, right? There are certain habits. Now, I have a habit of leaving clothes on the floor. I'm not alone. There are other people who leave, yes, right? And you have a system, and it's fine. Everything's fine. It drives Rick absolutely wild, and always did. He gave me very consistent, specific feedback about the clothes that I was leaving on the floor, and still, I did not change my habit. Several months later, we got Potato and Galactus Devourer of Worlds. They were 2 little kittens from the farm. They were very good, very easy to get them into our home. But Potato, like some cats, would occasionally miss the litter box. He wouldn't make it to the litter box. And I did discover at one point that he particularly liked to go pee on my clothes. Bear with me, yep, okay? So, of course, what did I end up doing? Anytime I left them on the floor, he would go and pee on them. So I started picking up my clothes, right? I didn't leave them on the floor anymore. And one day, as I'm picking up all of my clothes, it dawned on me this is absolutely a conspiracy between my husband and Potato. There's no other explanation, and this is very impressive. So the point of that is that there was something that was holding me accountable to actually picking up my clothes. Right? There was something that was going to prevent me from doing that, from creating that habit before it was too late. The point of addressing things like clarity and maintainability within our code reviews is to address these code smells before it's too late. We want to do it now when I can still wear the shirt I want to wear today, and not later when I'm trying to leave and pick up the shirt and realize that it's covered in cat pee and I'm not going to be wearing that tonight. We want to address these clarity, these maintainability issues, these code smells before a user can, or before it's really become a much larger problem. Thanks, Potato. All right, I promise I smell okay today. This was years ago. It's not happening anymore. All right, let's talk about efficiency. What's the performance impact? You can think about database queries, DOM manipulation. Hopefully you don't have to deal with a lot of that. Asynchronous JavaScript. If you're using an ORM, they can be, with great power comes great responsibility. They can be pretty dangerous sometimes. Or if you're using a library, are you using it appropriately? Do you have to use that library? Are you using one function of a giant library and you maybe don't need to use that library at all? And finally, style. So the question you're trying to answer, does this meet your style standards? Hint, you should have style standards. Our goal is to make it so that you can't tell who wrote the code, right? It should all very much look the same. You can think about things like comments. Do you expect your code to be commented? This is one of my very arbitrary and very silly pet peeves, but when a single line comment, when you got a / and then your comment, I really want a space after that second slash, and I know. Wow, that is never, okay, all right, my people, this is nice. But that's a very silly, arbitrary thing. In the end, it really doesn't matter. I have to tell you about SportsEngine now. Full disclosure, I have to tell you that we do not use semicolons in our JavaScript. Does anybody, who likes semicolons in their JavaScript? Yes, again, my people, right. It was a very hard habit to break. You don't need semicolons, actually, at all. It's fine. I've broken that habit over the last 2 years, and that's an example of something that is very much style. It doesn't actually matter, and we can all get over it. There's no need to die on semicolon hills. I considered it for a little while, but you don't actually need to. Think about things like line length, naming conventions. Are you using camel case and then suddenly somebody introduces snake case? Indentation, our favorite tabs versus spaces argument. And I think that's the gist of it for now. But I do want to say, don't spend your time manually reviewing things that a linter can find. We have tools that can do this for us. And I have found that it works much better when you have an automated tool telling somebody that they did something wrong versus another human telling another human that they did something wrong. These automated tools can hold us accountable without some of those dynamics that we sometimes have to deal with as humans. And it helps you break your semicolon habit if you have to. But now when I write CSS, I forget semicolons all the time, which is a bummer. All right, who should be involved? The intern, the CTO, the whole team? I would say you can keep the number pretty small for code reviews to be effective. You really don't need everybody to be there. Many teams ago, I worked on a team where we had 100% of our development team in a room for code reviews. Once a sprint. We learned a lot. I will tell you that it was valuable, but I don't know if it was like 8 development hours valuable to do that. I really don't think you need too many folks. You might be able to have 2 or 3, which would be kind of nice. But even if there's just one other engineer reviewing code, I think that can be valuable and effective. I'd also say to not be afraid to review code that you aren't familiar with, or even in a language that you don't know. there can be a lot of value in coming in with such a fresh perspective. Now, I don't recommend that you be the only reviewer on that particular code review, maybe somebody else who is familiar with the language or the code base, but it can be really helpful to have somebody who isn't familiar with a language or a code base to jump in there. And similarly, I will say to encourage juniors to review seniors, seniors to review juniors. Your job title really shouldn't have an impact on this. Really don't limit who can review just based on years of experience or that job title. You might want to, this is something that we do at SportsEngine, consider labeling reviews by risk. And if there is a higher risk pull request that wants to be merged, you can have somebody you have a smaller group of people who can sign off on those higher risk pull requests. So there's an additional review that happens. But that way, like at least for us especially, there's never any doubt that it's just like, hey, I have something that's ready for code review, I throw it in Slack, and whoever picks it up, picks it up. It really isn't we're not checking credentials before you start to review code. All right, when should reviews happen? All the time? That's pair programming at that point. Every commit, every branch merge or pull request, spontaneous, unscheduled, weekly, maybe on a sprint cadence. I've done a lot of different versions of this at different companies. I did at SportsEngine, we do it on every pull request, which is nice. Every single line of code here is reviewed before it gets merged. It's lovely, it's just part of our process. Nobody questions it. It's just something that we do. I would say the only drawback to that is that it can sometimes create a habit where we call it rubber stamping, where they just really want to get something out and they just need to get an approved code review. And you have to hold each other accountable to avoid that habit of rubber stamping. And I feel like that happened less often when I wasn't at a team that did that every pull request. I've done a lot of spontaneous unscheduled. These aren't mutually exclusive, by the way. You could do multiple ones. Spontaneous and unscheduled is a great way to start doing code reviews if your team doesn't do them currently. That's a nice way to get going. And then I've actually done code reviews on a sprint cadence. So we were doing every 2 weeks, we would release to production. At SportsEngine, I don't know how many times we release to production a day. There's hundreds, it's a lot. We release to production all the time. I know it's terrifying, but it works. It really just does. It's amazing. Thank you, ops people. So this other team, though, we release to production just every 2 weeks. So we would get together, do our code reviews before that release happened to production. So depending on how things are structured, you might want to make your code reviews kind of work around that. The big key, though, is making your reviews part of the culture. If you make it an essential step in your coding process, it'll happen. Treat it like unit testing, refactoring, QA, UX, if you're lucky enough to have UX designers. Once it's part of the culture, it becomes less of this like scary hurdle or thing that you're just asking this person so much to review your code. It feels less vulnerable once it becomes part of the culture as well. How should they happen? I think the big debate really around this is online versus in-person code reviews. I've experienced many different versions of this, and you can probably guess what the extrovert likes to do. So if you're doing something online, I think there's something very beneficial about having a record of the interaction that can happen. So if you're reviewing code, there's a document of how people talked about this thing, the decision that they came to, and you can reference it forever and always. Well, probably not forever and always, but for a long time, you can go back and reference it. I think having to think and write down the words that you want to say hopefully helps make people a little bit more intentional about the words that they are choosing when interacting with somebody about this. And at the very least, there's an accountability piece there, right? If somebody says something maybe really awful, it's written down. It's there to see. You can't take that back. Now it's there. I have found that online only does take a little bit of the humanity out of it. Sometimes when you're sitting down face-to-face and interacting with somebody, you might interact with them differently. You might choose your words differently. Body language is huge. The way your tone, all of that is an important part of how you deliver feedback, and taking all of that out of it and doing it exclusively online can also propose some challenges. In person can be really tough and uncomfortable for some people. Maybe you're not getting quite as much out of that code review because it's in person. I would not recommend a situation where somebody who's reviewing code is seeing code for the first time in an in-person setting. That should be code they receive ahead of time, have a chance to go over it, digest it, think about it, process it, before they bring their feedback to an in-person review. One company I worked at, we did a combination of online and in-person, a very formal combination. We would do all of our code reviews for a sprint online. We would write notes on them. We would get a chance to take in all the code. And then at the end of each sprint, we would do an in-person meeting together as a team. And we would go over comments that were left on the code review. So it gave us a chance to talk about it as a team. What was nice about that is a single person wasn't necessarily always dictating a certain thing. It was a single person brought this up, and then we had a chance to discuss as a team. We would often add to our standards, best practices, and patterns. We'd have an ongoing list of things that we wanted to perpetuate, and it gave us a chance to discuss that and decide that as a team. It took a lot of time, but I found that combination to be super valuable. I think at SportsEngine we do a bit of a combination with this, especially for the extroverts on the team. I have an instinct that if I'm reviewing somebody's code and I really feel like this, I'm gonna type a lot if I sit down and start doing this. And usually at that point, I'm I'm just gonna get up and go talk to this person, or I'm gonna get on a phone call with this person, and we're just gonna chat over these sorts of things. And that works fairly well. I think that happens a decent amount. I would recommend that if you do that, to follow up on that pull request and just add a note about what your discussion was. Make it clear that there was a follow-up, and maybe share what you two decided through that process. People spend a lot of time tagging other folks in code reviews as well, oh, maybe Amy has an opinion about this, or maybe, oh, Vivek left. Vivek is a dev here, and he was talking about before this how he has a lot of opinions. So it was going to be great to be oh, Vivek has an opinion on this, but he's not here, so that really just fell very flat. I'm so sorry. All right, anyways, online versus in person. This is a thing I definitely encourage you to experiment with. Find out what feels right for your team, and then keep adapting and evolving. If you go down the online route, there's a couple tools I want to point out. Crucible is part of the Atlassian suite. I used this for several years and loved it. One of the things that I liked about Crucible was that you could pick up different commits from different repos and put together a whole pull request. So if you had a feature that maybe spanned across multiple repos, it was a nice way to put together this whole story for a single code review. They also made it very easy for spontaneous code that maybe wasn't being tracked in a repo yet, maybe hadn't been committed yet. You could just throw a code snippet out there, and very easy to get review feedback on. It also is part of the Atlassian suite, so it's synced up super well with Jira and all the things. Upsource is another one made by JetBrains. This is one that we explored, and we ultimately decided on Crucible, but it was fine. We didn't do too much with it, so I don't have a whole lot of experience, but it's out there. And finally, you can just do your code reviews right on pull requests. This is what a lot of folks do, myself and SportsEngine included. It works really well, especially, again, for that piece where you want to make it a blocking thing, where you need to have at least one approving code review before you can merge it into master. It works really well. Now you're all set, right? Away, code review. It'll be fine. No, we're still here, unfortunately. I cringe when I think about the first time I gave this talk, because it really did just stop here. And I was like, yay, I did it. Everything's fine. But then I feel like you still have situations like this. I don't know if you can read this, but we have a code quality measurement, WTFs per minute. On one side here, good code, there's only 2 WTFs. And on the other side, there's a lot more than 2. There's even a dude in there, more profanity. And this, I just don't think this should be how our code is reviewed. I don't think that should be a reaction to seeing code. This is like my nightmare that I shared with you earlier. This is horrifying. But I feel like if we just stopped our conversation here, this could be your reality, right? WTF, this isn't maintainable at all. Potato is peeing all over everything. But that hopefully shouldn't be the case. Now this is the part that's really fun. So this is a real screenshot. identity is revealed here. So I want you to look at this code for a second before we get too into this. So we have a variable called BO, which I can only think of body odor when I see that term. I have no idea what this, I think it's order if I look at this enough. So we have somebody who's reviewing here, that's the blue person, and they jump in and say, can this be broken up so that it's more readable? All right, that feels like a reasonable suggestion. Now the author of the code, this is the orange person here, jumps in and says, I don't want to, in all lowercase with a period. The punctuation choice is striking for me. And then we have this purple person who comes in and says, for what it's worth, I had the same thought as the blue person. This is certainly not a hill worth dying on, which, side note, that implies that there are hills worth dying on, which I am concerned about. However, and as the author, I think he gets to make the final call, orange person. This is a lol sob moment for me, like to a T. And I'm going to brag about SportsEngine all day, but we are not perfect. And this is where it's super fun to give this talk here in front of my coworkers, especially at an event where we're like, we're hiring. It's great. Like everybody, though, this stuff is still going to happen, right? And it's about how we address it when stuff like this comes up. How do we hold each other accountable to better interactions, more respectful interactions? And the thing is, that orange person there is a really nice person. That's not a malicious person. That's a person with a lot of good intentions and who responds pretty well to feedback. So how do we deal with things like this when they come up? Because they are inevitable. And it feels a little bit like this sometimes, right? So-and-so thinks they know better. It's not good. So those soft skills, they really matter. They matter a lot when it comes to code reviews. They matter a lot when it comes to a lot of things beyond code reviews. And I want to spend the rest of our time together chatting a little bit about these things. To start, have a guide, decide what's important, and do not waste your time on what's not important, like semicolons. As much as I want it to be important, it is not. And I can learn to do something differently. There's no reason to keep bringing it up like I do, subtly. Sorry. Oh, this is the Minnesotan. It's coming out, right? The passive-aggressive side. So sorry. But there are certain things that you may come up a lot as a theme that your team really talks about. Make a decision and try to move forward. Now, things change quickly all the time, so your decision on something might need to be reevaluated. But even to write it down, I had one team where we wrote down some of these things in a Confluence document so that we could even articulate why this was the thing we didn't want to do anymore and kind of almost documented the conversation that had happened, because if something about that part had changed, then maybe this isn't a thing we need to worry about anymore. Avoid general feedback. It sucks. Always. That's funny, because that's general feedback. Sucks always, a little meta. Yeah, okay, thank you. I talk about feedback a lot. My coworkers in the room saw me give a lightning talk at our kickoff where I talked a lot about feedback. I talk about it so much that I had a former coworker who dressed up as general negative feedback for Halloween just to troll me. But it's very good advice. It's good advice for code reviews. It's good advice for your relationships. It's good advice for your coworkers, for all the things. So general negative feedback. This is the one I referenced very early on in this talk. This is sad panda worthy. These are direct quotes from code reviews that I have experienced. So one of them is, "This is messy." Okay, I'm so sorry that you feel like this is messy. I have nowhere to go with this. Imagine that you are brand new to development and a senior dev goes into your code and just says, "This is messy." What are you supposed to do with that? What about this is messy? How do I go back and improve this in a way that you see? LOL, what? That's a real thing. This was not at SportsEngine. This was a coworker of mine from a previous job, and this was on my code. It was very sad. We had a conversation about it later. I got an apology. Everything is fine. But that was a real thing that was thrown in there. And you never want to append in a loop. Does anybody know why this is on the general negative feedback side? There's a word in there. Never. Yeah, they give you that like marriage advice, right? Don't use never or always in a fight. That's just bad news. Similar with this feedback, avoiding things like never or always, such absolute statements is probably good practice. Sad parrot also is general positive feedback. As much as this makes us feel good, it's not super effective. This looks great. How many times have you just like reviewed some code and you didn't even have like anything specific, but you're just like at the approve, this looks great, go. If I get stuff like that, I'm like, but did you look at it? Because I'm sure there was something that was noteworthy. And also, this looks great, may make me feel great in the moment, but there's nothing specific for me to remember the next time that I'm writing something similar. Yay. Cool, glad you're happy. Party parrot. Also, like, that's delightful. That is a great way to use party parrot in a code review, for sure. But is also not super effective. And with code reviews, we're trying to create effective communication that can have real impact and change on our code. So on the flip side, specific negative feedback, that's pretty awesome. This function is missing a return type. That's very specific. That could be picked up by a linter, fun fact, but that's okay. Could we pull this interface out into its own follow so we can follow our single responsibility commitment? Pretty specific. It's also asking a question. It's making that pretty open-ended. Maybe there's a reason why the author decided not to do that, and this really tees them up to tell you specifically why they didn't want to do that. Specific positive feedback could include, yes, happy to see Flexbox being used, or these additional describe blocks really help organize our tests. These are super positive. They're pretty specific. You have an idea about what is making the reviewer feel good. Okay, so if I could, I would love to live in a world where I could just blindly assume positive intent and that everything would be fine. And this is advice I do like to give when talking about code reviews. I used to just have assume positive intent on a slide here and be like, yeah, everything will be fine, just assume positive intent. That person, when they said LOL what, they weren't being cruel, they were just being silly. Everything's fine. This comes with a super huge disclaimer for me now. I do want to encourage you to assume positive intent in one another, but that has to come with a pretty significant foundation. If you are working on an established team where you really trust each other, you trust those dynamics, then this can totally work. But I think the big message that I want to share here is be really respectful, be humble of one each other, be humble, and do what you can to trust your teammates. If you're questioning somebody's intent, that's a great thing to bring up and have a conversation with them. But I think it's super important that though we may have the best intentions, we still have to own the impact that we had. And that individual who said LOL what on my review had a pretty negative impact on me, and that was still something that he needed to own. I also really want to talk about bias in code reviews. This is another thing we can't just slip through. It's so funny. I'm going to tell you about SportsEngine again. So I found here in the 2 years that I've worked here that I have a bias in code reviews. When I am reviewing code that was created by somebody that I perceive to be senior or more senior than myself, I review that code entirely differently than I review code for somebody that I perceive to be more entry level or junior. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out why this is. Is this like a little bit of imposter syndrome where I'm like, well, I'm probably wrong. If they chose to do it that way, then that's the right way to do it. Or is it that I maybe just don't want to have an argument? This isn't a battle I want to fight or a hill I want to die on. Maybe I'm just not going to go there. But bias is important to identify. Figure out what yours are and actively work against those. I'm not saying it's easy. It absolutely isn't. But I don't want to go into code reviews thinking like everything's hunky-dory and everybody is treated fairly and that it's all the same. As a bit of a side note, there have been a few studies who have focused on gender bias in code reviews, specifically in the open source community. So if somebody had submitted a pull request and their name was obviously female or obviously male, their code would be reviewed differently. When they exposed the names, women were more likely to have their code rejected and sent back. And when they hid the names, women were far more likely to just get their pull requests accepted. I can share some of the links to those studies. There's lots of opinions and thoughts on the studies that happened, but it's just a point that we all absolutely have bias, conscious and unconscious bias. And when it comes to reviewing code, interacting with one another, these are things we have to own, be aware of, and work really hard to change and be conscious of. So again, when you're working in an established team where you really trust each other, this conversation looks a little bit different. But no matter what, I'd recommend that you have expectations for conduct with each other. It seems like a lot of overhead to sit down with your team and write a code of conduct for doing code reviews, but it can be really valuable. It's a tool that allows you to say, hey, the way that you just responded isn't cool. We don't do that here. That was like super general negative feedback, diving in here and saying like, this sucks, or LOL what. We've decided as a team that that's not a thing that we want to do. And call each other out when somebody violates it. Have a conversation about it and move forward. It's pretty effective. Easier for an extrovert to say, absolutely, I will own that. It's an extrovert who really loves feedback and is from the Boston area. I will absolutely call you out. Like, that's not a problem for me. I understand that that can be a lot harder for some people. But this is how we make our code reviews better. So I used to also have this slide. It's just about making code better. And I've even changed the way that I want to talk about that. I think why we do code reviews is actually more of a human aspect. I really think it's about empowering one another to write really great code. At the end of the day, I don't think this is about code. I think this is about wanting to support one another, wanting to create learning cultures in our environments, wanting to learn ourselves, wanting to teach others, so that we can write really great code. If you're not doing them yet, I totally encourage you to just give it a try. A spontaneous or unscheduled code review is a great place to start. These communities are great ways to do that too. If you've got some code that you really want to get a second set of eyes on, maybe you work on a team of one or very few, this kind of thing is a great way to be like, hey, can somebody take a look at this code for me, and kind of establish that process too. Give it a try. It can be really uncomfortable. It can feel really vulnerable. But the more you do it, especially with a closer team or with somebody you really trust, the better it gets. And that is all I've got. I don't know how much time that we have, but code reviews are often something that people have thoughts about. And I like to toss it out there for a little bit of questions or comments. You don't have to ask a specific question, but if something really stood out to you and inspired another thought that you want to share with folks, we can go ahead and do that.
All right, we're going to run a mic to people.
You kind of brushed over the topic of pair programming. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
You mean the pair programming or the reviewing all the time? Yes, yeah, I did brush over it. Yeah, pair programming, especially like how does that go hand in hand with code reviews? How do those two things go together? I think that's another one of those things that happens pretty organically at SportsEngine, where folks decide that they do want to sit down and pair program together. A lot of times it can be inspired from a code review comment. It's like, okay, I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you come work on this with me? We, speaking of like front end in particular, are trying to do like a donut buddies. Have you ever heard of donut buddies? Oh, okay. Donut Buddies is like a fun thing. You can get like a Slack bot for it, and it will pair you up with a random person, and it's a chance to like go get coffee or meet somebody that you haven't met before. We're going to use Donut Buddies for doing pair programming. So we're going to match people up once a month and have an opportunity for two people to pair program together. Even if it's just an hour per month, that gives people a chance to maybe code along with somebody they haven't coded before. And we've decided it's valuable enough that we want to make something accountable, like a once per month kind of deal. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so you mentioned sort of when reviews happen and that you are doing per pull request. Mm-hmm. But in those other cases where you're doing it weekly, sprintly, annually, hopefully not, with a pull request, it's very obvious what code is being reviewed. The review is in a context of a specific change. For those other like periodic reviews, how do you decide what gets reviewed? Because in a sprint or even a week, there might be way too much code to have one session of review.
Totally, that's a really good question. This was the thing we dealt with specifically at my last company, mostly because we felt like there was too much code to be reviewed, that it just wasn't realistic. We got into a habit where we would allow the author to choose. So each person, each engineer per sprint had to choose a certain amount of code for code review. It didn't work that great, to be honest. Like, again, speaking of accountability, a lot of the times the code we don't want to be reviewed is probably the code that we really need to be reviewed. It's the things we're not super proud of, we're nervous about, we're uncomfortable with. So that process didn't work out super well for us because there were things that should have been reviewed that weren't. What we ended up doing was we would kind of submit all of the code that we wrote per sprint. We would create code reviews for each of those, and we tried to prioritize them, and they were like kind of just sitting in a pool. This was using Crucible, and they were all out there. You could see which reviews were there, and we made a rule that if you were jumping in to perform code reviews, you had to pick a review that didn't already have a reviewer on it, find one that was like towards the bottom of the list, so that we could pick and choose as reviewers what we thought might be an essential part. It worked okay.
Question about cybersecurity. There's some, like coding constructs that hackers have been known to hack, or functions that are banned by the security community. Do you look for those in a checklist for your code reviews, or do you use tools to try to find those kind of things, automated tools?
Yes. So security is definitely a big part of code reviews that we should have. It should absolutely be part of our checklist. I am not a security person. I haven't a clue what I'm doing other than some pretty basics, sorry. In front of the bosses, I don't know what I'm doing with security. Everything's fine. Yeah, I mean, I understand, like, SQL injection is bad. But I think that's a thing that if you feel like there maybe are some security vulnerabilities, that's a thing where you tag in somebody specifically that is more of an expert on this. And at SportsEngine, we have folks like that, which is really helpful. And I'd also say that there are automated tools, similar to if you're linting code, that can lint your code for security vulnerabilities, and running that through the same process even before a code review begins. Like, the build doesn't pass unless it gets a certain grade on this. Andy has thoughts.
I was just going to add exactly what you just said. So
good.
We use static code analysis to do that mostly, and then we also have some dynamic code analysis things that we run, but it's all part of the pull request process. So.
Phew. Thank you, Andy.
We have one more over here.
Do you have any experience with offshore? Like, our pull requests sometimes take days, could be a week, because, opposite sides of the world.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's a couple aspects to that. Sometimes it can take a long time to kind of get turnaround on a pull request, kind of regardless if it's offshore or somebody in the same building. Sometimes those things just take time. We are pretty vocal, I would say, about saying that, like, hey, this thing's been sitting here for 24 hours and nobody's picked it up yet. We do most of our communication through Slack in that way. And even with folks that we had who are not in this office, they were also on Slack. They were part of the team in that same way. And we would submit and say, hey, in Slack, this thing is, I'm still looking for code review on this. And we've gotten into a habit of just reacting with the eyeball emoji if somebody has started reviewing that, and they've just claimed it by reacting that way, and then we let it go. But typically, we just keep pinging. We just keep asking until we get eyes on it, until we can get somebody to review it. I mean, the code review process itself hopefully doesn't need to take that long, especially if you're in a position where you can have really small pull requests. I know that's kind of a privilege sometimes, but the smaller the pull request, the easier it is to review, the less code that there is. I don't know if that really answered your question. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that?
I just want to agree with you on the pull request size. I feel like when the pull request is for a minimal amount of code and one discrete change, people will give it some thought and give you good feedback. And when it's like 10,000 lines of code, you're like, LGTM. All right, we have one more over here.
I actually just have a comment on the offshore thing, if that's in scope. All
Yes,
right.
please.
For offshore team members, what I've found is that you don't have an offshore team. You have team members who are offshore, and if you don't have that, you don't have a successful relationship. And as far as things like communication go, your offshore people are the same as people who are working remote or working from home. And if you think about, if you have a bad relationship or a non-effective relationship with people offshore, you might also have not effective relationships with people who are working from home because they have some, or just remote. So it's not just offshore, it's not just remote people, it's all of it. You need to have a cohesive team.
So many aggressive head nods during that. That's a good sign.
I think everyone agreed there.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it at this point, and we can have the traditional, everyone comes up to individually ask Amy all their questions. But please, let's give one more round of applause to Amy.